Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Arafat Tassin, and I have my co-host with me,
Hello, Sami
Somi.
here.
Yeah, and we have got a super interesting guest with us today, Dr. David Goad. Dr. David, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is David Goad. I'm a chief solution architect for the Automation and Innovation Hub at the University of Sydney. I'm also what they refer to as a Microsoft Regional Director, which means I get involved helping Microsoft out with a product roadmap. I also teach technology to business students at both the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales in their MBA program and their master's programs. So.
Cool. Thanks for giving us some time to chat about one of the most important topics of today. And whenever we try to read about AI and its implementation, a lot of people talk about ethics of AI and building it with responsibility and so on. So we would like to start with one of the basic questions around this, and that's about the risks. So why can't we just ignore the risks associated with AI and just move on? Would you like to shed some light on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing for me is it's not just about AI; it's also about IoT or the Internet of Things, right? And this idea that we're connecting the digital and the virtual world, the digital world and the real world together. I think when you start to do that, the impacts of making bad decisions or security issues become physical, and therefore you're not just talking about maybe losing some money or identity theft. You're talking about physical damage, right? People being hurt.
Mm-hmm.
The classic and very simple example for me of that is I drive a car. I have a car, and my car has a lane assist, which is an AI-based tool that basically tries to keep the car in the middle of the lane. I had a scenario a few weeks back where the lane actually collapsed into one. The AI couldn't understand it, and it actually slammed on the brakes, and the car started to wobble, right? I recovered. Point of my story is just to simply say, if you're going to start using AI to make decisions about what you're doing in the physical world, it better make good decisions. Otherwise, it could have a physical impact. In that case, it could have driven my car off the road, right?
Yeah.
So I think that as organizations use automation, not just AI, but automation, IoT more and more, they have to be more concerned about what they're doing with these technologies and how they're governing them properly, because it could have physical impacts. It could hurt people.
Yeah, this is very dangerous. Glad that you're safe.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't. I'm sure it would have been fine, but it was just my point of my story was to say even very simple things like driving a car with the automation that we're using can have a physical impact, right? So
True.
On the back of that question, what do you think that are the potential impact of unintended outcome of the AI?
Yeah, and you're right. I think you made the comment that people always talk about the ethical issues of AI, this concept of unintentional bias, right? The story is the AI making a decision, in terms of a home loan based on a person's ethnicity or some other factors that you don't want them to do, right? And this is true. These are issues, right? I think what organizations underestimate is the potential brand impacts of deploying AI badly. But I think there's other issues that people need to think about, the other unintended consequences, right? These are security. By some estimates, according to Gartner, something like 10% of AI deployments will have some sort of intentional security breach because people will poison the data that they're putting into these AI tools to train them.
Mm-hmm.
And so security is going to become even more and more important. Again, if you're connecting the physical world to the virtual world and you're getting these AI solutions to make decisions, security is going to be absolutely critical. But I also think there's a potential for people just to simply make bad decisions. These AI tools are trained with data sets based on the idea that the past is a good predictor of the future. What happens if that's not the case? I mean, look what happened with COVID over the last 18 months. Everything was completely different. You couldn't have predicted what was going on. So building AI tool sets that might have been based on historical data probably wouldn't have worked very well in that kind of context, right? And so I think people really have to understand how they're using these AI tools, what they're good for, what they're not good for, and recognize that if you give it bad data, it's going to make a bad decision. And so just because you put an AI solution in doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, you're going to get better decision making unless you have good governance around those solutions.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and that this brings to me to another question related to their implementation. That do we have any monitoring systems in place to provide any indications that there is a problem A, problem B, problem C with AI?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the vendors, Microsoft included, have started building tools. One of the tools they call is machine learning ops, or this is a tool that basically monitors, or you can use a set of tools that you can use to monitor your AI deployments, right? Your model deployments. There are also tools a lot of the vendors have produced, for example, to deal with the ethical aspects and the privacy aspects associated with artificial intelligence, right? Where you can test to validate that there's no unintentional bias in your models. The challenge with these tools is they're relatively early in their development. Most of the vendors have been putting them out in the last couple of years, and they're not being used very much. And I think this is the bigger issue, is getting consultancies who have good skill sets, who have the awareness that there are these tools out there, and that will help companies and organizations deploy them. So the tools are there, but the problem is I don't think people are using them as much as they should be.
Right.
Interesting. I mean, I guess it's kind of scary and interesting because we are training a model, but we don't know, we don't have any idea or indication of whether we produce a good model or the outcome is what we wanted to have. But I guess, is there any, to oversee the usage and the risk of AI in any organization, do you think that there is maybe there should be any dedicated team to be responsible for these individual cases?
Yeah, I think you could have a dedicated team. I don't think you necessarily need to. I think you have to have the right expertise. I think the biggest challenge, the biggest challenge is that organizations need to realize that their current ICT governance processes will not necessarily be good enough or cover the issues and risks associated with artificial intelligence. So if you begin with the first step, which is to recognize that you may need new processes and systems, right? And then just do proper AI risk assessments, bring in people who have expertise around the risks associated with AI. Then you can develop a plan, you can develop governance processes around those. Those governance processes may then suggest having dedicated teams or dedicated specialists, as part of your organization. But at the very least, you have to have skilled people. And I think that's one of the challenges right now at the moment. There are a lot of people out there who say that they're AI specialists when really they don't have the skill sets. And organizations get into trouble because people just don't have the experience that's necessary.
Yeah.
On the back of that, is it about having the... Sorry.
Sorry. Go on.
So having the dedicated team. So as you mentioned that we might not need a technical team. So from the business point of view, do we need other people, I don't know, maybe data sciences to help us out in that areas, or it just because being technical, knowing how to train a model and come up with a good result is one thing, but being able to find anomalies within the data, that's a different thing.
Well, yeah, I think you've raised a good point, right? So from a skill set perspective, in my view, you really need to have 3 skills in order to have good AI solution deployments. One, yes, you have to have people who have data science skills, right? Second, you have to have people who understand the underlying technical infrastructure, can be able to manipulate the data, can integrate it into the applications that you're going to use the AI. And third, as you've indicated, probably one of the biggest issues is actually being able to look at the models and understand, do they pass the Snicker test is what I always say. Do they actually make sense what they're recommending or producing? The challenge you find with a lot of organizations is that they don't have all those skill sets. They might have people who really understand the technology or understand the industry, but they don't have the data science skill sets. Or they might have the data science skill sets, but they don't understand the industry. And so you have to have all those skill sets, not necessarily in one person, but in the team deploying those solutions, they really have to cover off all those different skill sets. And then you have to have a senior management team that's really engaged and wants to participate and understand how you're using these tools. Because again, I think if there's a theme that people take away from this chat is that I think the business needs to be engaged when they start looking at using AI, and they need to understand the implications. They can't just simply say this isn't an IT problem, fob it off onto IT and let them manage it. They have to participate. They have to ask, make sure that governance is being put into place. They have to understand how these AI tools are working, how they're making decisions. And if you don't have that, I think you will have a challenge.
Yeah, that's correct. When you are talking about governance, and definitely it's not just an IT problem now. I absolutely agree. But I'm going to ask you a very broad question, Dr. David. And what processes do you think can an organization put in place to monitor, test, and mitigate before it actually goes to production? Are there any set of rules, or you want to shed some light on that?
Well, I think it's like look at, again, I go back to the people. How you need to make sure the people who are putting in these processes and systems have the skill sets, right? Have they been trained in ethical AI? You can actually take courses in that. When I had to get my certification in Microsoft AI, I actually had to take a course on how to do the ethical application of artificial intelligence, right? Do they understand how to manage these models? So I think the first step is you get the people who have the necessary qualifications. Then to me, it's just like any other quality system. Early in my career, I was actually a quality manager for a manufacturing company in Australia. And having systems and processes and auditing those systems and processes, it doesn't necessarily, they're going to be different depending on the organization. But just the idea of having someone come in and looking at whether you have an overall system and processes, right, that you can use, that's the important thing. So it's going to vary from organization to organization. But I think, again, it comes back to, do you have qualified people with the experience? And then have you put a process in place where you've looked at the risks associated with that with your organization, and you put processes in place specific to that?
That's correct. So in order to upskill their staff, are there any pointers, like you mentioned about Microsoft AI School? Is there any other school or any other course they can go and get it for their as an organization?
So most of the major vendors, including Microsoft, have certifications that you can take. Like I've actually taken multiple. So for example, if you want to pick Microsoft, I've taken multiple Microsoft certifications, and I've become an MCT in AI. But then there were other courses that I could take around artificial intelligence that talked about not just the technology aspects, but all the other issues associated with that, right? So I think there's a lot of content out there. There's vendor-specific content. There's also lots of universities that are offering AI courses. For example, next semester, I'm going to be teaching a course where I teach analytics and AI to marketing students, right? So the universities provide that out there. I think what you have to make sure of is that, the people that that they take advantage of that training, that they access not just the technical training, but also the business aspects of it and the governance aspects of it and all the other stuff that goes along with that.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I guess to your point, the combination of having both is really key to find out and mitigate the risk in these areas. And having said that, do you think these implementations should be, if any organization having trouble with their AI models are not getting enough or good or proper result out of their data, do you think these implementations should be independently reviewed by the external party or a fresh eye, or we need to upskill internal business, or then again, the combination of both might work better? I guess the situation might be different, but what is your recommendation on that side?
Having someone to come in and externally audit, if it's a specific critical process, that's not a bad idea, right? If it's something critical to your organization, particularly if you don't necessarily have the skill sets. One of the challenges with AI is, depending on the application, the math is different. And so it's not just about does your consultant or does your internal person have expertise in, data science and, the platform and your industry, but have they actually used those kind of models before? If they haven't, it might make sense to actually bring in an external expert to help review that. I think, but the most important thing is having that process, right? Having a system or a process that allows you to continue to build these. Because I think one of the things that people forget about AI tools is they're not set and forget. You don't just build them and deploy them and then walk away. You have to monitor them. You have to check them for drift. You have to make sure that there's no bad data getting into the model that's getting it to make the wrong decisions, right? There's stuff there are solutions that have to be monitored ongoing and updated and managed ongoing. So for an organization to use AI effectively, they're going to have to not only deploy it, but then have an operational capability to be able to manage it ongoing, to make sure that these models will continue to work, because it's just like anything else, any other kind of technology. They might have worked at one point, but then something's changed and now they don't work anymore. And so you need processes and systems to manage that. So to me, it's not just about a single check, it's about an ongoing system of processes. Does that make sense?
It does. But having an external party to come in and look into our data may raise another maybe risk, challenge, or issue to companies, saying that we don't want to disclose our information, our data to the external parties, and to come up and have a look on our data or the way that we are training our models. I don't know what is the best practices to maybe mitigate that issue, that risk, and maybe put them in a comfort mind that's saying that, okay, if we are there for, you know what I mean? If I go in and I want to say, okay, I want to have a look on your models and see how you're training your data. But that means that I need to have access to the data, and that is the cause. Another, maybe raise a flag for them. Hey, we don't want you to see our data. So that's
Like
the
a
question.
privacy concern.
Yeah, the privacy concern the organization might have.
And organizations have had that since the beginning of time when they brought in external consultants or external expertise, right? That is always going to be an issue. Again, there are tools that you can use that would still allow you to build the models, but will obscure the underlying data so people can't see, for example, personal information. So there are tools and ways of actually obscuring the underlying data, so you can still build the models on top of it, but people can't actually see the individual data points of that personal information, right? So you can do things like that. And then, as with most organizations, when they bring in consultants, they can sign legal agreements, they can put governance processes in place to make sure they're only getting the data that they need. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, if you're going to use these tools to make decisions that are fundamental to the business, that either will potentially have a financial impact, or, as I made the point earlier on in the session, a potential physical impact, because you're integrating these AI solutions with the physical world, you want to make sure that you're getting a good result and you're making good decisions. So I would suggest to you that bringing in the expertise and having the right people and having the right models is probably more important in some cases than the privacy aspects of it.
That is absolutely right. Thanks, David.
Yeah. So now I'm going to take you to another world, and I like our listeners. So and whoever is watching us. So there's another interesting question, and we would really like your eye on that and your view. So is it true that AI can wipe us out in future? Is it?
So you're talking about like Skynet from Terminator, or what was there was another name. The new Terminator had a different name for it, but some all-powerful robot computer that's going to become self-aware and decide to set off the nukes, and we're going to turn into a nuclear wasteland. Not in the short term. So what this refers to is this concept of what people talk about, which is general versus narrow AI, right? So narrow AI is where you're using artificial intelligence for a very specific application, right? Like, your Google Home, where you ask it a question, or using AI to predict, to analyze credit scores for a loan or something like that. That's a very specific application. General AI is where the AI, that's kind of like C-3PO from Star Trek, or C-3PO from Star Wars, or Data from Star Trek, where, like a human being, you can take what you've learned in one scenario and apply it to another scenario, right?
Yeah.
The challenge there is that most futurists will tell you that general AI is probably 30 to 40 years off. Narrow AI is very much here now. We get it all the time, right? Like I said, you got your Google Home, you got Netflix is making recommendations to you in movies based on AI. Same with Spotify, that automated, I was saying when I drive my car and it does a lane management. Those are examples now. But general AI is generally 30 to 40 years off. And the reason for that is the math that you use to recognize a picture is different from the math that you use to understand the spoken word, which is different from the math that you use to understand written text. There is no one set of math. There is no one set of tools, right, that allows you to do all these different applications. The AI tools that you use, the machine learning that you use, is very specifically the application. And so as a consequence, there's no sort of one universal tool that's going to be able to handle all those scenarios. The other thing is, and this is where I think in some cases, whilst AI is a very useful tool, a lot of organizations are investing in it, and it's going to create a lot of benefits for humanity, it is still not at the level of maturity that people think. So to give you an example, right, we talk about neural networks, right? So you talk about this idea that you're building mathematical models that are like the way the human brain works. If the human brain, and so if you know anything about the human brain, you have neural networks, and in those you have neurons, and those neurons randomly fire, and that creates this consciousness and part of a human being, right? A typical neuron in a multi-layer perceptron model, let's say, of an AI, might have one or two forms of nonlinearity, whereas in a human brain, they've recorded something like 26 in the typical neuron. If I built a convolutional neural network to recognize a photograph, that might have 100,000 nodes. The human brain has billions. So these tools and models that we're building are just nowhere near the complexity or capability of the human brain. So you put all that together, and technology is there. It's going to have some really great application, but you're looking at it's going to be quite a long time before you're going to get tools or machines that are going to get to that point. So a long way of saying you don't have to worry about, Skynet launching the nukes in the next year or two.
But yeah, that's interesting. That brings me to another question. That how do you say, Dr. David, that it is just 30 to 40 years away from it? Like how when you are saying that there is a different set of maths which can solve certain problems, and there is no general math as we can say that. So how do you predict that it is just 30 to 40 years away?
How do I pick that
why
number?
would we say?
Yeah, I mean, that number is if you listen to most futurists, that's the number that they would pick, right? They're just looking at the current progress of the tools, the current advancements. There's no doubt that AI has made huge advancements in the last 5 or 10 years, principally because of things like cloud computing and because of the fact that we have all this data now. So we have all this compute and all this data, therefore we can do more with AI. And the math has certainly advanced over the last 5 or 10 years, but it's still going to take some time. And so this is just what, when I say that 30 or 40 years, that's typically what the analysts would tell you.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Very interesting. I guess we have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait. This is true. I mean, lots of people have made, good careers in predicting the future. Me, not so much. So, you don't know. We'll see.
Cool. I'm going to ask another question, a bit different. So, which industry do you think is most vulnerable or exposed to the risk of AI? I mean, we are new organization, new companies are getting attention or moving towards using AI and MLs. But to your experience, your knowledge, which industries is most vulnerable?
Yeah, so there's a few industries that come to mind. I would say, for example, manufacturing, mostly because manufacturing, or what they used to call process control systems, have been around for years, right? So the manufacturing industry has been using tools to control processes and systems for a long time. So using AI to manage those processes or systems, is not necessarily, it's just an evolution of something they've been doing for a long time. When you have a manufacturing process where they're building, you have some big factory where things are under pressure and there's mechanical components and stuff like that. Again, you have the potential to hurt people, right? So I think there's, a lot of risks in manufacturing organizations related to artificial intelligence. It's one of the reasons why so I've been involved in a few deployments of AI solutions, particularly in the mining industry. And one of the things that those manufacturing organizations and mining organizations have been very cognizant of is having good security, because if someone hacked into their system and fed bad data, they could cause some major plant damage, right? And traditional manufacturing organizations, from a security perspective, used to rely on air gapping. In other words, their tools, their control systems were just not connected to the internet. That's not the case anymore, right? They are connecting them to the internet, so they have to have a better security capability. But basically, any organization that has a lot of data, there's more of an adoption of AI, and if there's more of an adoption of AI, there's more of a risk. Probably the other industry that comes to mind is finance, just because they're just so data rich. There's these banks that have just so much data, right? So they've been using AI in a broad variety of uses, and I have quite a few friends and some clients in the finance industry, and some of them are very, very mature in terms of using AI tools. But again, with bad governance, with people who don't know what they're doing, who don't have the right skill sets, with inexperience, there's the potential to cause a lot of damage. In that case, mostly from a financial perspective, but also potentially from a brand perspective, right? If, you're building some AI tool that's used to make credit checks, and it comes out that AI tool is prejudiced based on someone's ethnicity, and that gets out to the market, that's going to be a really negative brand impact, right? So there's a potential there as well, perhaps not as physical in terms of the potential danger, as in manufacturing, but certainly there's a huge potential impact to the industry or the business. And then probably the last sector I would say that, I think is interesting is health. So again, cybersecurity has become a big issue in the health industry, because if you're hooking up all these patients to all these IoT data points and collecting information, and then you're using, machine learning algorithms to be able to identify, bad things in CT scans and that, then you're going to need to have security, right? That's not to say that people are, I haven't heard any stories of people actively going out and trying to hurt someone, through the health sector by doing a cybersecurity hack. But then again, You hear of stories like in the UK and that where they had ransomware that locked down the whole national hospital service for weeks in the UK, right? So the healthcare sector is under attack, and if you're going to start using AI tools for diagnosis, then again security becomes an issue for them. So those are sort of maybe three of the industries that I think probably have the biggest risks, mostly because they're perhaps the furthest along in terms of the use of these technologies, and because they're using them more, therefore they're creating more risk.
Yeah, and health is very critical. It scares me when it comes to the theft of everything related to AI. So yeah, we are nearly. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Well, there's huge benefits in health, right? If you're a radiologist and you're looking at 200 CT scans a day, and you can have some AI tool that will look at those 200 scans and say, hey, look at Dave, worry about these 10 because these look like there's something wrong there. That's a very useful tool for a diagnostician, right? They want to have those tools, but if the tools are making the wrong recommendations because they've got bad data in them, either intentionally or otherwise, it's a problem, right? So, anyway.
Yeah, that 100% correct. Like it is mission critical and should be implemented in a way that is meant to be. So we are just on time, and I would like to ask you one of the last questions. In fact, the last question. So, what do you think? What should be the three best thing an organization can do who are creating AI-based solutions to mitigate the risks of AI?
So as I said, I teach at the UNSW Business School. I teach at the University of Sydney Business School. I teach a lot of executive education. And one of the biggest things that I try to get across to both people just starting out their business careers and senior management and organizations and CIOs and business leaders is they have to get engaged. In AI, more than any other technology, the business needs to get engaged. They need to understand how they can use AI, what the advantages of it are, what the disadvantages of it are, right? They need to participate in conversations with their ICT counterparts around governance and how they're going to use those tools and what their capabilities are and how they're going to make sure that they manage them, in an effective way ongoing. Because if they don't get engaged, right, then they have, potential brand impacts, right? They have potential physical impacts. There are things that could happen that could hurt people or cause the business a lot of damage, both financially and otherwise. And so these business leaders, they can't just sit there and say, oh, it's the IT person's problem, let them go off and do that. Or this data scientist, he's using terminology that I can't understand, or she's talking a language that I don't understand, right? I'm just going to walk away and let them make the decisions. No, you have to participate. You have to force them to talk in a language that you can understand and explain it to you. And so this is the first thing that I always say to business folks is get involved and push your ICT folks to have those conversations with them. I think the second thing that organizations absolutely have to do is recognize that their current processes and systems will simply not cope with, their current ICT processes and systems will simply not cope with how to manage AI from a governance perspective. And so you're going to need new processes and systems. And the best way of doing that is going and getting some, experienced organization and individual to do a proper risk assessment, to look at how you're using the tool sets, to make some recommendations, to develop a bit of an action plan, and from that develop a bit of a governance process, right? Which may include dedicated groups like you guys were talking about earlier, or may have certain individuals, or may, there's all kinds of different options, but just going through that exercise of actually saying, what do we need to do and what are the risks, and coming up with a plan. I think that's an important part as well.
Cool. So
Through that.
yeah, we are right in time.
We're right for 30 minutes. So yeah, cool.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, David, for being with us. Definitely, it was a wonderful, quick discussion, but really, really fruitful. Definitely for our listeners and viewers as well. We are super thankful to you because we have got an asset like you in our industry who we can reach anytime we want, and we can get some experts' opinion on different sectors as well. So this is really cool. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Awesome. Thanks guys. Thanks for the invite.
Great talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. We will be coming back with our next episode next month. So stay tuned.
Bye-bye.